Story 1. Ukraine trains allies. While Russia helps Iran with satellite data, tactical advice, and old-fashioned military partnership, Ukraine has suddenly ended up among the countries the US, the Gulf states, and Iran's neighbors are turning to for protection from Iranian drones. And there's a pretty harsh wartime logic to that. A country they spent 4 years trying to break with missile strikes and Shahed drones is now offering the world not pity, but hard-earned expertise. Zelensky said the US, the Gulf states, and several other partners had approached Kyiv for specific help defending against Iranian Shahed drones, and he ordered support to be prepared in a way that would not weaken Ukraine's own defense. This is not about symbolic solidarity. It is about interceptors, electronic warfare, training, and Ukrainian specialists on the ground. According to Zelensky, Ukrainian teams have already been sent to Jordan, and then to Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. Kyiv is directly tying this assistance to Ukraine's own need for Patriots and PAC-2 and PAC-3 missiles. Ukraine is helping close someone else's gap in drone defense while also reminding its partners what they could use to close its own gap in protection against ballistic missiles. What is especially telling is that back in August of 2025, Ukraine itself offered the US an anti-drone partnership for the Middle East, warned about the threat of Iranian drones, and showed ready-made solutions. But at the White House, it was treated more like a sales pitch. Now, according to Axios, those same American officials are calling that refusal one of the biggest tactical miscalculations before the war with Iran. Even the Fox News episode turned out to be almost symbolic. First, the network presented the Wild Hornet Sting interceptor as American technology, and then it had to admit that what viewers saw on screen was in fact a Ukrainian development. In other words, Ukraine is no longer just asking for weapons. It is showing the world that it has created some of the needed weapons itself. Against that backdrop, 11 countries, including Iran's neighbors, European states, and the US, have asked for Ukrainian experience in countering drones. Germany is already inviting Ukrainian instructors to teach the Bundeswehr modern warfare, and Israel, according to Ynet, also requested a conversation with Zelensky specifically because of Ukraine's experience intercepting Iranian drones. In response, Iran declared Ukraine a legitimate military target. It sounds dramatic, but in substance it only underscores reality. Tehran has long been waging war against Ukraine through Russia's hands, and now it is nervous for another reason too, because Ukrainian technology is starting to work against its own drone model in a different theater. This whole story matters not just as a diplomatic episode. It shows something simple. For 4 years, Ukraine learned how to shoot down Iranian drones under Russian strikes, and now that experience has become an exportable form of power. And that is why others are now coming to Ukraine for what they once could not be bothered to hear in time. Story 2. Orbán's gamble. The conflict between Ukraine and Hungary looks less and less like a normal dispute inside the EU and more like one of Orbán's pre-election special operations, where Russian oil, Ukrainian bankers, and European money have all been mixed into one toxic cocktail. The formal trigger was a damaged section of the Druzhba pipeline after a Russian strike. Budapest and Bratislava are demanding access for an inspection, hinting that Kyiv is exaggerating the scale of the destruction, even though the Ukrainian side says the damage was severe. A fire in a 75,000 cubic meter tank took 10 days to put out. Cables, transformers, and the leak detection system were damaged, and the evidence has already been handed over to partners. Against the backdrop of continuing Russian attacks, demanding that the pipe serving Hungary's dependence be repaired as the priority sounds cynical, to put it mildly. Orbán went further and promised to break the Ukrainian oil blockade by force, even though this so-called blockade appeared after a Russian bombardment. Zelensky answered in his usual style. He does not go inspect other people's Patriot warehouses when he is told supplies are low, and he expects the same basic trust when Ukraine says its infrastructure has been destroyed. At the same time, an even dirtier scandal broke out. In Hungary, 7 employees of Ukrainian state bank Ashad Bank were detained while transporting currency and banking metals between Austria and Ukraine under an official scheme. Kyiv called it an unlawful detention, sent a formal note, and later the Hungarian side announced deportations, trying to portray routine banking logistics as something suspicious. In practice, this looks like a demonstrative seizure of people and money at a political moment when Orbán is desperately trying to hold on to power ahead of the April elections. Ukraine is already officially advising its citizens to avoid travel through Hungary because it can no longer guarantee their safety there. Even the leader of the opposition TISA party, Peter Magyar, who has every reason to distance himself from Orbán, was forced in this story to speak the language of national sovereignty rather than Ukrainian solidarity. That in itself shows how deeply Orbán has baked anti-Ukrainian rhetoric into his own election campaign. But behind all this hysteria, a larger picture is visible. According to Vesquare Project and to Magyar's own words, Russian agents and political operatives linked to the Russian main intelligence directorate are working in Budapest with one goal: to help Orbán hold on to power. So this is no longer just about an inconvenient ally. It is about a Kremlin effort to preserve its outpost inside Europe. That is why the next month around Hungary will be loud. And the main question here is not really about Druzhba pipeline, or even about Orbán's latest stunt. It is whether Putin will keep his man inside the EU, someone who knows how to turn Russian interests into European sabotage. Story 3: Students for War. Russia is pushing the war deeper and deeper into universities, colleges, and civilian life because the old conveyor belt of cannon fodder is no longer enough for the system. And the more insistently it does this, the clearer it becomes. This is no longer about recruiting willing volunteers, but about a system of coercion and deceit. According to the Institute for the Study of War and Russian independent sources, the recruitment of students is already happening in several stages. First elite engineering students, then debtors and failing students under threat of expulsion, and now almost everyone. They are being sold a fairy tale: drone troops, a one-year contract, and service far from the front. But lawyers say plainly that no special contract exists. This is a standard open-ended contract with the Defense Ministry. Once it is signed, the recruit will be sent into assault units on the front line, exactly where personnel losses are highest. Usually with little or no proper training, which is why many of them do not survive more than a week. At this point, the scale no longer looks accidental. At least 57 universities and 13 colleges have joined the campaign, and by other counts, more than 100 educational institutions across Russia and occupied Crimea. In some places, like Korolov in the Moscow region, administrators are not just campaigning. They are pressuring students, interrogating them over criticism, and effectively tying continued study to a willingness to go to war. For those who do sign, reality hits them at the front. A 22-year-old assault soldier described an attack where 3 men came out alive out of 149, while his dead father is listed as deserted. Another serviceman from Yekaterinburg described a failed assault near Kramatorsk, where almost the entire group was wiped out by mortar fire after being ordered to stay in position. Stories about quiet service in the rear usually end the same way: a person suddenly finds himself in an attack in a 3-man assault group. Even pro-war Russian military bloggers and veterans themselves are now warning students not to sign such contracts, because promises about rear service, guard duty, or drones end in assaults, death, amputations, and the impossibility of resigning. When people who once served that same machine start warning others about its recruitment system, that usually means the lie has become too widespread to hide. The same pattern is visible in the war's other reserves. Russia has recorded a historic low in its prison population, which the Supreme Court is trying to sell as humanization, even though in reality people from penal colonies, pre-trial detention centers, and even before trial are being processed into military resources. And now Putin is demanding that former war participants be recruited into the police to cover staffing shortages. In other words, the state first turns people into carriers of violence, and then puts that same violence in charge of the streets. In the end, the picture is completely clear. Russia is no longer just waging an aggressive war against Ukraine. It is devouring its own institutions, turning universities into recruiting points, prisons into a mobilization reserve, and the future police into a holding pen for war veterans and impunity. A system like that knows only one method: lie, pressure, and throw people into the meat grinder for as long as there are still bodies left. In brief, the week's other developments. Russia's advance in February slowed to 126 square kilometers, almost half of January's pace, and over the week from February 23 to March 1, Russia actually lost 16.2 square kilometers. That is a clear sign that Moscow's offensive capacity is cracking under drone strikes, manpower shortages, and stubborn Ukrainian defense. At the junction of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions, Ukrainian forces continue tactical counterattacks and clearing operations in the gray zone. Estimates of the scale vary, from cautious language about stabilization measures to dozens or even hundreds of square kilometers of gray zone, but the overall meaning is the same: Ukraine is not retreating there. It is breaking Russia's plan and biting back part of the initiative. At the same time, in the east, the heaviest risks remain in the directions of Dobropilya, Pokrovsk, Mirnorad, Kramatorsk, and Lyman. Russian command is still trying to crawl toward the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration from different sides, but it is doing so at the cost of heavy losses and without the operational effect it was clearly counting on. Ukraine, in Zelensky's words, has lived through the hardest winter of the entire war and preserved its energy system despite thousands of drones, hundreds of missiles, and the fact that not a single power plant was left undamaged. For a country Russia wanted to freeze and break, that is not just a utility result. It is a strategic failure of the Russian plan. At the same time, Kyiv is strengthening its own air defense and internal resilience. It is expanding the capabilities of corporate air defense groups, preparing the front for spring, increasing drones, electronic warfare, and robotic systems, and also introducing mandatory evacuation of children from combat zones even without parental consent when there is a direct threat to life. Russia, as before, continues to rely on terror against civilians. Attacks on Kherson, Kharkiv, Odessa, Chornomorsk, Slavyansk, and Kramatorsk, on civilian trains and on heating and energy infrastructure, bringing new deaths and injuries almost every day. Ukraine's ombudsman reported that by the end of 2025, Russia had executed 337 Ukrainian prisoners of war, and more than 95% of prisoners are subjected to torture. These are not isolated excesses. This is a systemic practice in an army where war crime has long since become part of everyday military practice. After Chancellor Friedrich Merz's visit to Washington, Germany continues to insist that Ukraine cannot agree to any new territorial concessions, and Sweden detained the Russian Shadow Fleet vessel Kafa. Even when the world's attention shifts to Iran, pressure on Russia still holds. And that is exactly how it should work. Thanks for watching. Sources and links are in the description. If you'd like to support the channel, the links are below. See you next week.